In the Old Testament, during one of Israel's darkest periods, there lived a prophet named Elijah. His very name meant "My God is Yahweh," and he would live up to that name in ways that would echo through history. This was a time when King Ahab ruled over the northern kingdom of Israel, and the land had fallen into spiritual darkness unlike anything seen before. King Ahab had not merely turned away from the God of his fathers, he had actively embraced the worship of Baal, a Canaanite fertility god. But the true architect of Israel's spiritual downfall was Queen Jezebel, Ahab's wife and daughter of the king of Sidon. She was a woman of fierce determination and ruthless ambition. Jezebel had not only brought her foreign gods into Israel, she had made their worship the official religion of the kingdom. The queen's persecution of God's prophets was systematic and brutal. She had established a program to hunt down and execute every prophet of the Lord she could find. Her table fed 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, while God's servants were forced to hide in caves and remote places to survive. The prophet Obadiah, who served in Ahab's household, had secretly hidden 100 prophets of the Lord in 2 caves, providing them with bread and water to keep them alive. It was in response to this spiritual apostasy that God had sent a severe drought upon the land. For 3 years and 6 months, the heavens had been like bronze above Israel. No rain fell, no dew formed in the early morning hours. The once fertile land became parched and cracked. Rivers that had flowed for generations dried up to dusty beds. Wells that had provided water for centuries went dry. The people watched helplessly as their crops withered in the fields and their livestock died of thirst. The famine that followed was devastating. Mothers searched desperately for food to feed their children. Families were forced to sell their possessions just to buy a handful of grain. The wealthy hoarded what little food remained, while the poor faced starvation. Throughout it all, King Ahab refused to acknowledge that the drought was connected to Israel's abandonment of the true God. During this time, God had sustained Elijah in miraculous ways. First, he had sent the prophet to hide by the brook Cherith, where ravens brought him bread and meat each morning and evening. When that brook dried up due to the drought, God directed Elijah to Zarephath, where a widow's small jar of oil and handful of flour never ran out as long as the famine lasted. God had even raised the widow's son from the dead through Elijah's prayers. Now in the 3rd year of the drought, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth." Elijah knew this meant the time had come for a decisive confrontation. As he made his way towards Samaria, he encountered Obadiah, who was out searching for grass to keep the king's horses and mules alive. When Obadiah saw Elijah, he fell on his face and said, "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" "It is I," Elijah replied. "Go tell your master, Elijah is here." Obadiah was terrified. "What sin have I committed that you would hand your servant over to Ahab to be put to death? As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear they could not find you." But Elijah assured him, "As the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today." When Ahab saw Elijah approaching, his face darkened with anger and frustration. The king had blamed the prophet for all of Israel's troubles, refusing to see his own role in the nation's suffering. "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Ahab called out. Elijah's response was direct and unwavering. "I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." Then Elijah made his bold proposal. "Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." Mount Carmel was strategically chosen. This mountain ridge stretched from the Mediterranean Sea inland, and its name meant garden or fruitful field. In better times, it was known for its lush vegetation and abundant springs. But now, like the rest of the land, it showed the effects of the prolonged drought. The location was also significant because it had been a place where the Lord was worshipped in earlier times, though Baal worshippers had also claimed it as sacred to their god. King Ahab sent word throughout all Israel. The message spread from town to town, village to village. All the people were to gather at Mount Carmel to witness something unprecedented. Curiosity, desperation, and hope drew them from across the kingdom. They came on foot, in carts, on donkeys, thousands upon thousands of Israelites making their way to the mountain. When the great day arrived, the scene was extraordinary. The slopes of Mount Carmel were covered with people as far as the eye could see. Families sat together on the rocky ground. Farmers who had lost their crops stood next to merchants who had seen their businesses fail. Children clung to their parents, sensing the importance of the moment even if they didn't understand it fully. The 450 prophets of Baal arrived in their ceremonial robes, confident and proud. They were well-fed and well-dressed, a stark contrast to the common people who had suffered through the famine. These were men who enjoyed the queen's favor and the kingdom's resources. They had been trained in the elaborate rituals of Baal worship and were skilled in working their followers into religious frenzy. When everyone was assembled, Elijah stood before the vast crowd. Though he was just one man facing hundreds of opposing prophets and thousands of people who had been following false gods, he showed no fear or hesitation. His voice carried across the mountainside as he issued his challenge. "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him." The people said nothing. They had been caught between these two choices for so long that they had become paralyzed by indecision. For years they had tried to worship both the Lord and Baal, thinking they could somehow benefit from both, but now they were being forced to choose. Seeing their silence, Elijah continued, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." The crowd stirred with excitement. This was a test they could understand. Fire from heaven would be unmistakable proof of divine power. The prophets of Baal accepted the challenge eagerly. They were confident in their God and their elaborate rituals. They chose their bull and began their preparations, building their altar with great ceremony. The animal was slaughtered and cut into pieces according to their customs, then laid carefully on the wood. As the morning sun climbed higher, the prophets of Baal began their ritual. "O Baal, answer us!" they cried, their voices rising in unison. They had been trained in the art of religious ecstasy, and they threw themselves into their worship with tremendous energy. They danced around their altar with wild abandon, their robes flowing as they leaped and spun. Their chanting grew louder and more frenzied as the hours passed. Some played instruments, drums, cymbals, and flutes, creating a cacophony that echoed across the mountain. Others waved their arms toward the sky, pleading with their God to show his power. Hour after hour they continued. The sun rose higher, and the heat of the day began to take its toll on the performers, but still they persisted. Sweat poured down their faces as they maintained their desperate dance. Their voices grew hoarse from shouting, but they did not stop. The watching crowd grew restless as noon approached. They had expected something to happen by now. Some began to murmur among themselves, wondering if their prophets were losing their power. Others urged the prophets to try harder, to shout louder, and to dance more vigorously. At noon, when it became clear that nothing was happening, Elijah stepped forward. His voice carried a tone of mockery as he called out, "Shout louder!" Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. This taunt stung the prophets of Baal into even greater frenzy. Their pride was at stake before thousands of witnesses. They began to shout even louder, their voices cracking with strain. Some began to cut themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed freely. They believed that their own blood and pain would move their God to action. The afternoon wore on, and their desperation became more apparent. They threw themselves on the ground before their altar, pleading and begging. Some collapsed from exhaustion, but forced themselves to continue. Their fine robes were torn and blood-stained. Their carefully arranged hair was disheveled, yet still their God remained silent. As evening approached and the time for the regular evening sacrifice arrived, it became undeniably clear that Baal would not answer. The prophets gradually fell silent, defeated and humiliated before the entire nation. They had given everything they had, but their God had not responded with even the smallest sign. Now it was Elijah's turn. While the prophets of Baal had been engaged in their frantic worship, Elijah had been calmly waiting. Now he called the people closer. "Come here to me." They gathered around him as he approached the ruins of an old altar to the Lord that had been torn down during the persecution of God's prophets. With deliberate care, Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel. As he worked, he may have spoken the names: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. These stones represented the unity of God's people, despite the political divisions that had split them into northern and southern kingdoms. He built the altar in the name of the Lord, then dug a trench around it large enough to hold about 2 seahs of seed, approximately 13 quarts of grain. This trench would play an important role in what was to follow. Elijah arranged the wood on the altar with the same care that the priests in the temple would use. He cut the bull into pieces and laid them on the wood, just as the law required for burnt offerings. Then Elijah did something that amazed everyone present. Water was precious beyond measure during this drought. People had been rationing every drop for months. Yet Elijah commanded, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." The people looked at each other in astonishment, but they obeyed. Perhaps they brought water from the Mediterranean Sea, which was not far away, or maybe they had saved some precious fresh water for this moment. They filled the jars and poured the water over the sacrifice. "Do it again," Elijah said, and they did. "Do it a 3rd time," he commanded, and they poured water over the sacrifice a 3rd time. By now, water was running down the sides of the altar and filling the trench around it. Everything was thoroughly soaked. If fire were to consume this sacrifice, It would truly be a miracle that no one could attribute to natural causes or human trickery. As the sun began to set, at Mount Carmel, Elijah stepped forward to pray. His prayer was simple, direct, and filled with faith. Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. But it came from a heart that trusted God completely. Elijah wasn't trying to manipulate the Almighty or bargain with him. He was simply asking God to demonstrate his power for the sake of his people. What happened next was beyond anything the people had ever witnessed. Fire fell from heaven, not ordinary fire, but the fire of the Lord himself. It didn't simply light the wood, it consumed everything. The sacrifice was devoured instantly. The wood was burned up completely. Even the stones of the altar were consumed, and the dust around it was licked up by the flames. Most amazingly of all, the water in the trench was completely evaporated. The display of divine power was so overwhelming that the entire crowd fell face down on the ground. Thousands of voices cried out in unison, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" The sound echoed across the mountain and into the valleys below. The demonstration was complete. There could be no doubt about which God was real and powerful. The contrast was absolute. Baal's prophets had cried out all day with no response, while the Lord had answered Elijah's brief prayer with overwhelming power. Justice followed swiftly. Elijah commanded the people, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Don't let anyone get away." The crowd, still overwhelmed by what they had witnessed, obeyed without hesitation. All 450 prophets of Baal were captured and brought down to the Kishon Valley, where they were executed according to the law that called for the death penalty for those who led Israel into idolatry. With the false prophets dealt with, Elijah turned to Ahab and said, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." The king, shaken by all he had witnessed, went to refresh himself. Meanwhile, Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel. There he bowed down to the ground and put his face between his knees in intense prayer. He was asking God to fulfill his promise of rain. Elijah told his servant, "Go and look toward the sea." The young man went and looked, but returned saying, "There is nothing there." 7 times Elijah sent his servant to look. Each time, the servant returned with the same report. Nothing. But Elijah persisted in prayer, confident that God would keep his word. On the 7th time, the servant returned with different news. "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." That small cloud was enough for Elijah. He told his servant, "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds, the wind rose, and heavy rain began to fall. The drought was over. The land that had been parched for 3.5 years was finally receiving the life-giving water it desperately needed. This remarkable story teaches us timeless truths about God and faith. There is only one true God, and all other gods are powerless imitations. God remains faithful to his people even when they turn away from him. One person standing with God is more powerful than hundreds standing against him. God often waits until situations seem impossible before he acts, so that everyone will know the victory comes from him alone. The story of Elijah at Mount Carmel reminds us that our God is real and powerful. When we trust him completely, he shows his faithfulness in our lives. We don't have to face our challenges alone. The same God who answered Elijah is ready to help us too. We can trust him with our impossible situations, pray to him with simple faith, and watch him work in amazing ways. As it was true for Elijah at Mount Carmel, so it remains true today. One person plus God always equals victory. Thanks for watching. If this message has touched you, subscribe to our YouTube channel, like this video, share with someone, and leave a comments below